Dr. Michael Connelly, Dr. Shijing and Dr. Lynn Paine, new members and renewed members, students, colleagues, friends around the globe. It's my highest honor to greet each and every of you and welcome all of you to CIES 2023. My name is Jun Lee, CIES 2023 Conference Chair and the President-elect, a professor at Western University, Canada. I'm proud that we have recorded around 3,500 participants, with over 2,800 of them as on-site participants, and over 2,500 new members this year. I just want to thank you all very, very much to join us. Before I introduce our chair, Dr. Lynn Paine, for this first keynote event, please allow me to thank our sponsors. They are American Institutes for Research, Childhood Education International, FHI 360, UNESCO Future of Learning and Innovation, UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development, University of Pittsburgh and Western University, NORAC, Network for International Policies and Cooperation in Education and Training, English Department, English Language Programs, U.S. Department of State, and Mathematica. Thank you so much, our dear sponsors. Now, please allow me to hand over the event to our chair, Dr. Lynn Paine. I just want to introduce her briefly. I know many of you know her very well, and we don't have time to introduce too much, but still, I just want to briefly introduce her. Dr. Lynn Paine is a professor of teacher education and associate dean for international studies in the College of Education at Michigan State University. Having begun as a secondary school teacher, she is now a university-based teacher educator and a scholar of comparative education. At MSU, in her administrative role, she supports international and global education initiatives in the College of Education. Dr. Paine's research focuses on the comparative studies of teachers, teaching, and teacher education. She studies teachers learning in and from practice with extensive fieldwork in China, the United States, the UK, and other systems. Past projects include leadership of 2 US NSF, National Science Foundation, funded comparative case studies of comprehensive teacher induction and participation in NSF and IEA studies of teacher education. Presently, she is examining global reform discourses of teaching and teacher development. Having served on US National Research Council, advisory groups, and the board of the Comparative and International Education Society governing, she currently leads the OECD Education 2030 thematic working group on future-oriented teacher agency, teacher well-being, and teacher competence. Lynn, please.
Thank you for that warm welcome, and welcome everyone. I am delighted that we can all be here together for the first keynote session of this 2023 Comparative and International Society Conference. We're delighted to have this opportunity to be challenged to think about the important issues of transforming education for a more equitable world, with a keynote by our distinguished speaker, Dr. Lynn Darling-Hammond, and remarks by 2 distinguished commentators, Dr. Shijing and Dr. Michael Connelly. Our plan for today, I'm going to briefly introduce, I'm not doing justice to any of our speakers, but I'm going to briefly introduce Dr. Darling-Hammond, After her remarks, I'll then briefly introduce Dr. Shijing and Dr. Michael Connelly, and they'll make some remarks, and then we hope we'll have time for Q&A. So again, welcome everyone, and I want to start by introducing our keynote speaker. I think actually few of you attending today need an introduction to Linda Darling-Hammond. She's a singular voice in the field of education, focusing on both educational research, policy, and practice, leading innovative thinking about interventions in education in both the US and internationally. Linda is a rare scholar whose work combines sustained, important, cutting-edge analyses of challenges and of possibilities facing US education at the same time that she has contributed powerfully to international and global discussions about education reform. I know of no other scholar who's able to speak, and in fact regularly does speak, consistently to local groups of practitioners and policy leaders, to national and global stakeholders in the way that she does. Her scholarship draws on her extensive experience in and commitment to practice, as well as her deep knowledge of and experience in educational research and policy. Throughout all of her work, across her career, there's a very strong through line of an interest and commitment to equity. And so I'm excited that this is the focus of her presentation today. I'm now going to rush through a very long vita. I hope that you all, if you have not already, will acquaint yourself with her distinguished record. Dr. Darling-Hammond is the Charles E. Jacoman Professor of Education Emeritus at Stanford University and founding president of the Learning Policy Institute, created to provide high-quality research for policies that enable equitable and empowering education for each and every child. Time limits mean that I can't do justice to her career or her contributions, but I just want to highlight the range and impact of her work. This is a person who has founded a public high school and research centers. She has been president of the American Educational Association, the American Association of Arts and Sciences. She's a member of the American Association of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Education. In 2006, she was named one of the 10 most influential people affecting educational policy, helped lead the Obama education policy transition in 2008, and the Biden education transition team in 2020. In 2022, Darling-Hammond received the Edon Prize for Educational Research in recognition of her work that shaped educational and policy and practice around the most equitable and effective ways to teach. I followed her career with admiration, and I've watched her create award-winning books that really shape the conversation. And just this month, my graduate class has been reading her 2017 book, Empowered Educators: How High-Performing Systems Shape Teaching Quality, that draws on international collaborative study of systems that support educators that can make a difference in the lives and learning of children and societies. Thank you for joining me in welcoming Dr. Darling-Hammond. Linda, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. That was such a generous introduction. And Lynn, I just want to say once again how our hearts are with you and all your colleagues at Michigan State in this moment. And I am going to see if the technology will allow me to share my screen. Let's see if it works. And here we go. So I'm thrilled that CIES is taking on this issue of developing a more equitable approach to education. I mean, that's always been a theme for CIES, but really tackling it this year. It's an amazing time for that. And one of the things that we're all experiencing is the public health crisis, the economic crisis, the climate crisis, the civil rights crisis that has emerged over the last few years. All of these things have highlighted longstanding inequalities in societies and education systems. And when we think about the anatomy of inequality, certainly it begins quite often, as it does in the United States, but many other countries, with poverty, the distribution of wealth in the society, and often segregation layered on that poverty. In many places, that also is accompanied by unequal school resources to the places that serve students with the greatest number of needs. That often leads to an inequitable distribution of well-qualified educators, which undergirds unequal access to high quality curriculum and often leads to dysfunctional schools. And while these are the broad social issues around equality, I do have a special concern for the ways in which the inequitable distribution of adequately qualified educators really makes a difference for what happens for children, in addition to the allocation of resources. We find in many, many studies that when people come into teaching without the kind of preparation they need for this very, very complex job, they often have an inadequate understanding of learning and development and pedagogy. We know a lot about what enables people to learn, but if you haven't had access to that knowledge, you may offer poorly organized instruction. Quite often it focuses on low-level skills. You may not have the tools to scaffold learning to really help students successfully address the tasks being brought to them in the classroom. It's also associated with exclusionary discipline. If students misbehave in a classroom that is not very well organized, they may be pushed out rather than supported to engage. It also leads to more tracking because it takes more skill to teach a heterogeneous class well, and tracking is sort of a way to reduce the variation in achievement to date in a class, which is often done when teachers have fewer skills. And then there's a failure to understand students' social, emotional, and academic needs quite often. If you add to that implicit bias, which is widespread, certainly in the United States, but we're not alone in that, it can add the assumption that students are incapable, that families don't care. It can exacerbate harsh discriminatory treatment of students and activate stereotype threat, such that the stigma that may attach to some of the identities that children hold get activated in a form of a fight or flight anxiety syndrome that undermines confidence, reduces the capacity of students to think and perform well, and makes it difficult to take on a growth mindset. So we've got all of these challenges that have emerged and that are continuing to be part of our daily existence. And in human history, such moments often lead to generational social changes, to major changes that we were not able to accomplish previously. This is taking place at a time when demand for skills has been changing faster than our education system in many cases has been able to respond. There's much more demand for complex higher order skills of the sort that we used to allocate to a relatively small number of students who were tracked into the special or advanced classes or courses, less demand for routine skills. And the dilemma of schools in many countries is that the skills that are easiest to teach and test are also the ones that are easiest to digitize, automate, and outsource. We're at a moment in human history where knowledge is growing exponentially. Some colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley, have been doing studies about the growth of knowledge in the world, and they found that between 1999 and 2003, there was more new knowledge created in the world than in the entire history of the world preceding. And knowledge now, for example, technology knowledge, is doubling every 10 or 11 months. And so we can't think about education as a fixed basket of knowledge to divide up into 12 years of schooling and give to students so that they can memorize it and spit it back on tests of their ability to recall. We've got to prepare them in ways that are very, very different to be able to engage in the world and continuous acquisition of knowledge in ways that are very, very self-initiating. Right up the street from me here in Silicon Valley is Google, and they used to collect in their very large workforce all of the transcripts and test scores and various accoutrements of traditional schooling as part of their selection process. They did giant studies to see how those various indicators predicted success at Google. And they found that none of them predicted success at Google. In fact, what they found mattered was what they called learning ability, the ability to find and use resources, to pull those together, to create a product or a solution, to a problem of practice, to do that collaboratively, to then be able to test that and take initiative and plan and improve their own work, to self-manage, to learn. So these are really the kinds of skills that in this moment we also need to be imparting in schools that have not originally been designed for that particular task. We also know that in this kind of a context, the ability to do those things is very tied to social and emotional learning habits and mindsets, including how we manage ourselves and understand our emotions and manage our behaviors, being able to be socially aware, relate well, and interact and collaborate well with others, make responsible decisions. Also, planning and organizing, being able to be a organized and disciplined problem solver, being persevering and resilient, and having a growth mindset. So this sets the table for a very different kind of teaching that also needs to emerge in this time. We found with meta-analyses, in fact, there are more than a dozen meta-analyses of social emotional learning all over the world. We just at LPI have put them together for a publication that draws on researchers in the Netherlands and Romania and Australia and the US. And consistently, we find that these kinds of skills produce safer schools, higher achievement, higher graduation rates. So the ongoing challenges to education are that we have new knowledge and skills that require changes to schools. We need curriculum that builds learning ability. We need to pay attention to social emotional learning. We need assessments that support problem solving and agency, not just picking one answer out of 5 and bubbling it in. We need to develop applied skills for this new age, the ability to use knowledge in action. And we have this demand for equity because, in fact, the world demands that all of us be prepared for this kind of higher order thinking and performance. So, we think about what is next for us as a human species at a time, by the way, where if we don't become more able to solve the major problems that are before us, we may no longer have a planet. So we really have to be thinking about reinventing school as we are restarting in this post-COVID era. And how do we use this time to support systemic change? I talk about reinvention because the schools we have in many places were designed in the early 1900s, or maybe the mid 1900s in countries that became independent from colonialism during that period of time, but they were not particularly designed to support relationships, the whole child approach. They were designed more on a factory model, the sort of assembly line of getting kids from grade to grade, from teacher to teacher, from one set of lesson plans to the next. They weren't particularly designed for personalized supports and definitely not for equitable opportunity or achievement. In every country, educators and policymakers are trying to move the bar towards more equitable opportunity, but there is always a tug of war between those who would like to preserve their advantage in the social order and those who would like to spread that advantage to more children. When we think about what is school for, there's another dimension to this. Our schools really were, for the most part, designed to select and sort students for opportunities who, along a monodimensional bell curve, allocating societal roles and benefits, access to opportunity in school, access to college and higher education, and in some cases, providing trained and low-cost workers for business. And in this moment, where students are going to have to come into a society where they're working with knowledge that hasn't been discovered yet, using technology tools that haven't been invented yet, solving these major problems of climate and distribution of resources and health and safety around the globe, as well as the capacity to avoid and mitigate conflict. We need to be sure that every young person has access to developing their full talents. We're going to need all of that potential to create the common ground that allows us to be a collective together and to provide more empowering forms of learning. When we think about restarting and reinventing school, at least in the context that we've been approaching at the Learning Policy Institute, we mean focusing on authentic learning and equity. We mean harnessing the knowledge of human development, learning, and effective teaching accumulated over the last century and needed for the next. There's been a worldwide effort to synthesize and understand what the science of learning and development tells us, what neuroscience, developmental and learning sciences, anthropology, sociology come together and allow us to understand about how people learn and develop. And so some of this in the United States has been published in Applied Developmental Science, several papers that are syntheses across all of these domains about how children learn and develop, and how relationships and contexts shape that learning and development, and what the implications for practice are of this science of learning and development. And I've worked with colleagues on this agenda, both in a research space, and we had a national commission in the United States, actually looking at the brain basis for social, emotional, and academic development. And what we learned from the science of learning and development, of course, is vast, but a few major points that are relevant to schools. The first is that the brain is always developing as a product of relationships and experiences. It's not baked and done when we're born. It's not like we are definable from the moment of birth as to what our possibilities may be. The quality of those relationships and experiences matters greatly. And so that's what schools are all about, is structuring those relationships and experiences. We also know that learning is social, emotional, and academic, that they are completely tied to one another, that you learn more effectively in an environment where you feel safe, secure, where you're not experiencing identity threats or stereotype threats. The brain operates more productively in that kind of a setting than one in which there's anxiety, stress, or trauma. We know that children actively construct knowledge by connecting what they know to what they're learning, and this always happens within our cultural contexts. And so the teacher's ability to understand those cultural contexts is very key. Students' perceptions of their own ability influence learning. So when we have systems that label and sort students and identify them along the bell curve in ways that we've artificially constructed, that then actually impedes learning for those who feel like they have been identified as less capable. We know that trauma, which is widespread in this pandemic era, and adversity affect learning. But we also know that relationships are very important for healing, and schools need to be both trauma informed as well as healing oriented in the way they do their work. And finally, we know that a child's best performance occurs under conditions of low threat and high support in settings where they're accepted, respected, and enabled. So a lot of what we thought when we were investing in the factory model schools that were adopted in the 20th century has proved to be false. We used to think that genes drive who we become. We now know that only about 10% of our genes are expressed ever, and they are the ones that are expressed are a function of the context that we are in. We know that talent is not scarce, that it is plentiful, that there are lots of abilities that students have. It's not on a bell curve in its actual presentation in life. We thought that average stands for the individual. We should teach for the average. In fact, average almost never represents an individual. If you are not familiar with the work on brain variety, you can look at 100 brains and none of them look alike. And so we've got to understand that we have to be able to think about the path to learning for different students who learn in a variety of different ways. The factory model we thought was the way to educate students in a standardized way, put them in groups and move them along the conveyor belt, some of them on different parts of the conveyor belt in tracking systems. But we now know that agency and engagement is what actually supports the kind of deeper learning that leads to learning ability. We thought that we could know how kids were going to turn out from the very beginning, put them in their different groups and treat them accordingly. But we now know the potential is visible in environments that are designed to reveal it. And so structuring those environments is the job. That means the kind of schools we need are not individual students working at individual desks, memorizing and filling in their workbooks and doing their individual work, but that schools need to be designed for inquiry, which is the way that human beings learn, they need to be designed for collaboration. They need to be designed for iteration, which is also part of the way we learn, learning content and taking on tasks and iterating towards improvement. We also know that schools, if they're going to be successful for most students, need to be places that produce much less cortisol, which is the hormone that when it floods the brain actually shuts down neural connections and makes it difficult to pay attention, to focus, and affects the brain architecture, and need to be much more focused on producing oxytocin, which is what I think of as the hugging hormone. And when it floods the brain, it actually produces more neuron connections. It actually creates more brain architecture that allow for greater intelligence as well as for learning in the moment. We've been working around how would you take these ideas from the science and bring them into schools. And we've developed a set of equitable principles for whole child design. There are 5 big features of what schools would work toward to be able to provide these environments that are productive of healthy development, learning, and thriving. Positive developmental relationships. These are relationships that are not only positive, but that are long-term, deep enough that adults can help children develop on all of the domains of development. Environments that are filled with safety and belonging, rich learning experiences grounded in inquiry for knowledge development, developing explicitly those social emotional skills, habits, and mindsets that make us successful not only in school, but also in life, and then creating the kind of integrated support systems that remove obstacles to learning, which may have come from outside of the school or inside of the school, but that provide ready academic supports as well as supports for health and mental health that allow children to be successful. So that means thinking about sometimes restructuring schools so that they can be personalized, smaller schools and learning communities, continuous relationships provided by looping systems, where teachers stay with the same students for more than 1 year, which produce higher achievement, advisory systems in which there are small groups of students with teachers over multiple years who meet together regularly to learn social and emotional skills, to be supported in their academic work. So there's always someone who knows each child well, and then actually planning time in school for those connections to parents and families. We need to build those then environments that support trust and belonging, and those really need to be designed around culturally competent teaching practices that connect students to the school and the curriculum. We need to understand our students as well as our subject matter. As John Dewey put it, you bring the child to the curriculum and the curriculum to the child. And that means that teachers need to develop a two-way pedagogy where they're learning about students as well as thinking about how to present the content so that the two are making that connection and each child is feeling included, academically, respected, socially, and able to relate to one another. We know that the curriculum, instruction, and assessment that support deep learning and motivation and a growth mindset build on that prior knowledge that students have, design tasks, authentic, engaging, meaningful tasks that have just the right amount of challenge and support, that integrate inquiry with explicit direct instruction, that explicitly reduce stereotype threat by making it clear that each student belongs in the classroom, is a member of the classroom, is believed to be and supported to be competent, and then that explicitly supports metacognition and learning to learn in a growth mindset, and that offers the opportunity for feedback, reflection, and revision, which is a very important piece. If you've looked at, of course, there's a lot of research on this, but John Hattie is one of the folks who has synthesized that research on the process of doing work, getting feedback, reflecting on it, and immediately revising or redoing the work. That is how we build high levels of competence, which require a different pedagogy than give a chapter, give a test, give a grade. This has been known for a long time. Benjamin Bloom, many years ago in 1984, he published this very famous 2 Sigma study, which synthesized a lot of research, but basically the tradition of get through the book, teach, test, grade, does produce something that can look like a normal curve. But when you use mastery learning, where you teach, apply, produce, get feedback, and revise until you get to mastery, the whole curve of student achievement moves to the right and improves. And when there is the opportunity for one-on-one or a very small group work for tutoring that teaches to the very specific needs of a student with that kind of recursive process, you get a much narrower band of inequality in outcome, and you move the distribution again to the right, such that a student who would have been at the 50th percentile could grow to the 98th percentile if you were maintaining that bell curve metaphor. That explicit focus on social emotional skills and mindsets includes the kinds of processes that produce identity safety, as well as explicit plans and processes and practices in schools that teachers and students and administrators share for resolving conflict, for collaborating together. It's really another whole curriculum for providing restorative opportunities where community is explicitly built in community meetings and circles and other strategies that allow kids to come to know each other and develop empathy, develop a knowledge of each other so that bullying disappears, so that students who do have challenges or missteps have an opportunity to learn how what they are doing influences the community, to make amends and reattach to the community rather than being pushed out. And then these structures that go beyond the school, the multi-tiered systems of support and that extended learning of tutoring rather than tracking are part of a system that could really get us to a much more equitable set of outcomes for students and much more equitable experiences in school. Now, if we want to get to systemic progress at scale, we need to have this whole child approach, which is also attentive to the resources that the state or government directs to schools and how those are aimed at pupil needs, both in terms of dollars and personnel and expertise. We need to be explicit about what 21st century curriculum and assessment mean. We need to invest in skilled teachers and leaders, develop those wraparound supports, and be sure as well that there's an on-ramp from early childhood education where the brain is growing and developing so quickly in the 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old period of time that to neglect it, we are learning, is really a recipe for greater inequality. When we look across the world with OECD studies and so on, this one looks at the allocation of resources along the x-axis from less equity to greater equity. And in the upper right-hand corner, you see those jurisdictions that have above average mathematics performance on the PISA tests. In the upper left quadrant of low equity, you would see those who have high achievement on those tests, and it's a null set. The circle is empty because you really cannot get to overall high achievement if you don't invest equitably in those students with more resources to those students who need them the most. Part of that quest, of course, is investing in well-trained and well-supported teachers and leaders, because at the level of the individual child, we know we cannot create teacher-proof curriculum that will do the job of meeting the personalized needs of students. Back in 1991, there was a very important cross-cutting study that looked at what were the resources that made the most difference in student achievement gains. This happened to be in Texas, and Ron Ferguson was the author his conclusion that the evidence suggests most strongly that teacher quality matters and should be the major focus of efforts to upgrade the quality of schooling has been replicated in other studies since then. When we think about then that question of how do you invest for equity through the way that educators are supported and learn, that's when we really can develop a sort of a systemic approach to what is often very piecemeal, a variety of different people coming into the profession with different preparations, treated differently, et cetera, in a lot of countries. So Lynn mentioned Empowered Educators. It is a study that we did a few years ago in 5 jurisdictions when we were in Canada, China, Singapore, Finland, and Australia, looking at particular states within the larger countries, Shanghai in the case of China, New South Wales and Victoria in the case of Australia, and Toronto, Ontario, and Alberta in Canada. And we found in all these places that they were able to support a highly thoughtful, equitable system for preparing and supporting educators. I will say the politics in some places have frayed over the years. So what we found then, even a few years ago, is not entirely the case in some countries now, but most of it still remains. And we found that there was this very holistic approach to preparation, induction, ongoing professional learning, appraisal, career development, curriculum and assessment, and the way schools were organized and funded that all led to fairly consistently high quality of teaching. What we learned about preparation in these jurisdictions is that most of them were making clinical master's degrees the norm for preparation, with common expectations for entrance. They'd adopted professional standards of practice, what teachers should know and be able to do, that were infusing that preparation. Very interesting that the programs were becoming not only research-based, so teachers knew what the research would say, but research-oriented so that they themselves could be researchers in the classroom, always looking at what's happening, reflecting, and drawing conclusions for how to improve their practice. Grounded in an understanding of learning and development, learning in practice with significant, substantial student teaching experiences with expert mentors, and often in these sort of professional teaching school partnerships. And those are very important, I think, to creating a system in which all teachers are well prepared. Finland is the one that we all probably know the most about. Finland made a decision in 1970 to invest in high quality preparation for all teachers. Teachers there get essentially a 5-year preparation, 3 years in what is sort of an undergraduate set of courses to which they're admitted and which there are elements of studying pedagogy as it relates to content, then a 2-year master's program, which is very focused on research. You have to be able to show you can read research as part of the entrance exam. It's very focused on supporting the needs of the students who struggle to learn, which then gives teachers the tools to support the learning of all. And every teacher is trained in a model school attached to the university or in a partner school. All of them are regular public schools serving the wide diversity of students, which in Helsinki is much, much greater than most people realize. The common languages in schools that I visited included not only Finnish and Swedish and some Russian, but also Swahili. There were a lot of immigrants also from Somalia, Ethiopia. Arabic was taught in most of the schools. So, but these schools are performing equitably with other schools because they have this very, very intense high quality teaching, and the mentor teachers are themselves clinical professors and practitioners who are engaged in research themselves. The kind of standards of practice that are trying to move people towards this 21st century learning to learn are very interesting. And in Shanghai, instead of having like the Iron Chef and Ninja Warrior, they have teaching competitions. And this is a picture of one of them. Some of the most expert teachers exemplify, instantiate these standards with classrooms of students, aiming for higher order thinking skills, for attending to the needs of students, so that there is a way by which that art form can be communicated, studied, and be part of the building of expertise around new standards in practice. We found in all these places very well-structured induction for beginners, regularly guided by senior and mentor teachers, with sort of a curriculum for induction. In Toronto, amazingly, a 4-year induction process, very, very carefully designed, produced retention rates for beginning teachers of 98% after 4 years. And we found that attrition rates for beginning teachers and teachers generally were very low, which means they did not have to experience the kind of shortages that come from having high attrition and then having to replace people regularly and being unable to do that effectively. So this is a very important piece because we often lose a lot of beginning teachers, or they become less effective than they might have been had they been able to be under the wing of a senior mentor teacher. Now, they designed a structure in almost every country to ensure that there would be master teachers, lead teachers, senior teachers. In this case, this is Singapore's career tracks. Those are available at every school. Teachers can decide to go along a teaching track, a leadership track, or a senior leadership track for specialists, for example, in curriculum or assessment. And they get training for free, both to come into teaching with a salary while they're being trained, and for each of these roles along the way. And then they are available to spread expertise in the schools. And we found that also depended on the ability to have time for expertise sharing and collaborative learning and development. This is the schedule for a senior teacher in Singapore. And you can see that the orange spaces are the academic teaching, and there are about 12 hours a week where Rosmilia is teaching students. And then other times where she is engaged in professional learning and planning, supporting the work of other more junior teachers, supporting a team that's engaged in action research. And there's a lot of opportunity for teachers to share what they know, to problem solve together, which also enhances equity in the school. It's not the one teacher that you get assigned to. It is a system of expertise development and sharing and support that is underway. And the career structures that can support recognition and sharing of expertise. In these countries, salaries are comparable to other professions requiring college degrees. This happens to be teachers who are being honored along a wall in a Shanghai school, equitable across schools and districts, so that you had the possibility of recruiting and retaining teachers equitably everywhere, enhanced for teachers taking on additional responsibilities, explicit career ladders in Singapore and Shanghai, one under development in Australia, a career lattice in Ontario. The difference between the sort of concept of merit pay, which is that you hand out bonuses to some teachers each year if you think they're doing better than other teachers, and career ladders, is that these are all about teachers taking responsibility for practice together and developing and sharing their expertise. This is an action research team in a Shanghai school where they meet regularly to think about what they'd like to understand, study. Most teachers in Shanghai have published in practitioner journals. Some of them have published quite a lot. And so teaching is thought of as an intellectual act, as well as one that is very much focused on outcomes, because the research is always about how do we improve our practice, and then how do we understand how that affects student learning. Australia was doing advancement through standards that were adopted that are very much like what in the United States we call the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, through a review of teacher portfolio and practice by external evaluators, and then teachers again taking on roles as mentors and leaders. You can see this career lattice depiction in Ontario, again, with the idea that teachers are really always learning, sharing what they learn, and being recognized and positioned so that what they know can extend beyond the classroom. So when we think ahead to how do we develop transformation in schools that leads to greater equity, and we think about what the anatomy of equity would look like, it certainly is not only about the quality of teaching. It has to begin with supports for children, food, housing, healthcare, preschool, academic supports. It has to include equitably allocated school resources, but then it also needs well-prepared and well-supported educators in every single school, in every single classroom, who are organized to continue to improve the quality of practice in their own classroom and school and in the society as a whole, so that we can move toward the kind of sophisticated learning needed for all students in innovative and effective schools. I'm going to close with the words of a parent who we connected with as we were looking at the reinvention and restarting priorities that ought to be thought about in this moment. And she said, reprioritize. This is the time to see if something can be different. To reset the system, we have to take a loss, but we can recoup the loss if we actually get kids excited about education and create a more positive space for them to learn. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Linda. I'm sure we all are feeling you've given us lots to think about, both the big picture and some very vivid examples. You're helping us think about, as the parent said, what to prioritize, what to notice. We have some questions related to that, actually, that we'll come back to. But I want to briefly introduce our two commentators, and I ask their forgiveness in advance because I'm not doing justice to their backgrounds. But it's exciting, as Linda has described, really thinking about a system for a transformed system of education that supports equity. We have two scholars who, throughout their careers, have been thinking about making sense of educational change across boundaries and from the lives and voices of people in the system. So our first commentator will be Dr. Shijing Xu, professor in the Faculty of Education at University of Windsor, Canada. She is also Canada Research Chair in International and Intercultural Reciprocal Learning and Education. Her research interests focus on narrative approaches to intergenerational, bilingual, and multicultural educational issues and cross-cultural curriculum studies and teacher education. Her current research is on West-East reciprocal learning and education. She has won many awards. I will not list them all here, but she, I know, has much that she's going to bring to this discussion. Our second commentator is Dr. Michael Connelly, Professor Emeritus at Ontario Institute in Studies and Education at University of Toronto. He has studied at universities in Alberta and Chicago. He's a co-founder of Curriculum Inquiry. He served in many roles, including leading doctoral programs both in Canada and in Hong Kong. He supervised well over 170 postgraduate students, many winning awards. And he's worked not only in Ontario, in Canada, but Egypt, Australia, UNICEF, the World Bank. He is a collaborator with Dr. Xu on this reciprocal learning project, and I look forward to hearing comments from both of them. So thank you, Shijing. I think you're going first, right?
Thank you, Dr. Lynn Paine. Thank you for the introduction. I'd like to thank Dr. Jing Li, the president of CIES, for inviting me to be one of the commentators of Dr. Darling-Hammond's keynote speech. It is such a great honor. Thank you very much. I truly enjoyed and appreciate the speech just delivered by Dr. Darling-Hammond. I found your talk so exciting, inspirational, and encouraging for us educators to think about education improvement and change in the current divided world at a tense, deteriorating, and grooming era of pandemic, environmental and economic crisis, and global relations. Your essential guiding principles for equitable whole child design offer a hopeful guidance for systemic change. As you point out, new knowledge and skills require changes to schools, which in turn requires changes in our teacher education programs. When restarting and reinventing schools, we need to also restart and reinvent our teacher education programs as part of the systemic change. I especially like your emphasis on the importance of culturally competent teaching practices that connect students socially, emotionally, and academically in a trusting learning environment with equitably distributed educational resources, positive relations, and collaboration among school staff, and also with student families. I also like your emphasis on the importance of preparing students to be collaborative, resilient problem solvers with a growth mindset, able to survive and thrive in this increasingly complex world. The examples you take from Finland, Australia, Singapore, China, and Canada are illustrative and insightful. Yesterday, I chaired a panel on research of future schools by a group of Chinese scholars. I especially like the point made by Professor Shenyuan Tao about future schools. He says, in future schools, students need to learn how to coexist with other people. This matches the guiding principles Dr. Darling-Hammond has just mentioned for the building of future schools. We need to prepare young generations to be socially, culturally, emotionally, academically competent to coexist and thrive in this world in harmony and peace, rather than to be competitive against others. I echo Dr. Darling-Hammond's call for empowered educators who go beyond the content knowledge to teach students learning abilities, teamwork, problem solving, and communication skills intended to prepare them for a rapidly changing future. Professor Darling-Hammond, I greatly appreciate your globalist and internationalist vision of change in education. Your talk demonstrates avenues where people of different cultures can learn from one another and work collaboratively for a better world. My work with Professor Michael Connelly on the Canada-China Learning Partnership finds itself at home with your work, Learning to Teach for Social Justice, in which you point out the importance of crossing boundaries, learning across disciplines and methodologies, across communities and cultures, learning across ideas and ideologies, and across the many groups of individuals who make up a school, or for what matters in an education system. In our West-East Risk Learning Partnership project, we noticed that mutual adaptation and risk learning between non-Western ethnic culture groups and the Western mainstream society were not in the mainstream thinking. Therefore, we use West-East instead of East-West in our project conference themes and writings to bring more attention to the West learning from the East and to the creation of a spirit of we-ness. We have come to a crossroad in our work when the global landscape has changed dramatically with increasing tensions and conflicts. The world is increasingly divided. The current global landscape seems to discourage what Professor Ruth Hayhoe and many comparative and international scholars have dedicated their life to knowledge across cultures through dialogue across civilizations. I found that Professor Darling-Hammond's talk provide useful tools and also a hopeful guiding framework for us to think about the future schools in our comparative and international studies when we work to have university educators and school educators in different countries with different ideas and different ideologies come together in collaborative and sustainable partnerships with mutual respect, trust, and appreciation for a shared goal of improving education for a more equitable world. Thank you, Dr. Darling-Hammond. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Michael Connelly to make your commentary. Dr. Connelly, please.
There, do I have it?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Shijing Xu, and also thank you, Lynn Paine, for your introduction, and also a special thank you to CIES President Jun Lee, who is doing a remarkable job of bringing forward an important conference. And of course, I want to thank Professor Linda Darling-Hammond. I want to thank you for your far-reaching headlights on the road ahead. I was thinking as you talked that Professor Paine, who described a course that's built around one of your writings, is going to have another course around your presentation today. It was very comprehensive. It's a pleasure and a privilege to offer commentary on your unmatched experience and your legitimacy as a speaker on this important conference topic. I wholeheartedly agree with my colleague Shijing Shu's observation that your current ideas provide a frame, a cloud in the metaphoric language of the computer age for the work that we've been doing in our educational partnership studies with China. If I understand some of your previous writing and advanced ideas correctly, country-to-country collaboration is needed to foster global equity relations and would occur at the national level. Our work is not quite at that level, but our primary funding is Canadian national through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Our work with Canadian and Chinese school and teacher education programs tapped into a practical, on-the-ground landscape with positive cross-cultural collaborative spirit in schools and school systems. We've been at it for close to a decade, and during that time, we sensed an expanding cooperative arena for our work. The hopefulness, and the encouragement contained in your words helps make sense of this energetic spirit. But notwithstanding this energy, the contextual tide has changed. You may have received a survey that recently crossed our desks exploring the academic backlash and impact currently experienced by China-based scholars in the West. The cultural equity experienced in country-to-country collaboration is under siege. I think it was Michael Apple who one time said that social movements drove educational direction and change, and that academic arguments, theories, and actions could, at best, help adjust the trajectory. Now, you, Professor Darling-Hammond, are an incredibly experienced scholar, with unmatched policy, research, and practice credentials. There's no one like you. Your presentation today is a kind of resource library to current best ideas and practices. You've held and hold positions at the intersection of social movements, scholarship, and practical action. Given the global state of affairs, there's no one better than you at this point in time to undertake John Dewey, and I was delighted that you mentioned him earlier, John Dewey's remarkable mission in his experience and education, the small document where he undertook a dialectic inquiry of the two ideological sides driving Western educational thought during his generation. A 21st century version is needed. You, above all, I think, are positioned to write it. My colleague, Shijing Shu, and I talked about this question a good deal. We wonder if you might have thoughts on how to conceptualize a way forward along your road to the future with your ambitious ideas on equity crafted within the ideologically driven political frameworks in which we all currently find ourselves. We wonder how you see the future unfolding given the global political and policy landscape. And that's a question we'd just like to leave with you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you, Mick, you've given Linda the first question. We have others we're also going to discuss, but thank you both, Shijing and Mick. And Linda, would you like to respond?
Well, thank you. That was quite an agenda that you've put before. I would say this is an agenda for all of us, right? And, you know, one of the things I think about, because there's always so much struggle in putting forward these ideas of equity and, organizing societies to try to be supportive. It's always 2 steps forward and 1 step back. The politics will always be there. Human history has never been steady progress. It's always been, some progress and then some pushback. And we always feel these forces people entangling with each other. So I think that I put a lot of hope in, first of all, I think that international agreement that is forming around what we know about human learning and development, what I called the science of learning and development, is one platform on which we can start to build that next system that we need. If we can, both get the agreement about that and then get the opportunity for voice for educators in government's systems of design for an investment in schools. I think that we also, need to make this, need to understand that you can't change systems without enriching the knowledge base of the people within them, right? There's a lot of reform that has, failed because somebody had an idea and they said, here's my idea, and maybe they sold it to some policymakers and the policymakers said, that's a good idea, let's mandate that idea. And, without care for the people in the system who are going to be the enactors, as some say, street level implementers, and without investing, in that knowledge base and that capacity. So I think that's got to be a big piece of what we try to do. And we've seen around the world that various places have done really good work at moments in time that we can learn from. You can never borrow something and then just plop it down somewhere else, but we can continue to learn. And the more we have a shared conversation about what should happen and how it should happen, and a shared commitment to investing in the educators who are going to enable it to happen, the more traction we can get on that road ahead. I am an optimistic person. Some people say it's, that the glass looks half full when you're short because you're looking up at it. And I'm kind of short, so that may be why I'm optimistic. But I also recognize that when you have a moment to make change, you have to take advantage of it because there will be a pushback. So I'm not, naive about that. I've been involved in the political space of policy for enough time to see that happen. So we have to really be aware that it's always a process of bringing more and more people also into the dialogue so that there's a broader and broader consensus about what will, remain in the moments of, inevitable tussle that will follow.
Thank you.
Linda, I'm going to pick up from your response just now, where clearly you're thinking strategically and weave together a couple of the questions that we see in the question and answer. There are questions, several of them are asking you to extend your thinking and say, how then does this apply to sort of another place besides the places you've been thinking about? So whether it's other geographical or nation state contexts, or whether it's thinking about different levels of education, higher education. So let me combine 2 questions. One that says, low resource, highly populated countries often have low educational outcomes. What would you suggest, given limited resources, should be the top priority, most strategic actions of these countries? And then I want to add Steve Cleese's question that says, and Steve, I'm going to paraphrase this, that there's certainly actors who are providing a sort of suggestion about strategy and focus in what Steve says is a narrow focus on something they would call learning poverty, and they're advocating simplistic input-output thinking. What do we do in a world like that? So how do you think about taking what you have been learning and arguing for and thinking about other contexts?
Well, I guess I'll make 2 comments about that. I mean, there are no easy answers, but you think about a place like Singapore, which now is, one of the high achieving countries in the world and, very invested in their education system. But in 1965, when they gained independence from Great Britain, there was no real education system there. The only people who had been educated were there's a very small, there was a private school sector, there was a very small wealthy class, and there were some British schools, but there was not a public education system. The Malay people of Singapore had been really denied access to education in very discriminatory ways. They had to build a system, kind of from scratch. And you can find this in a number of countries, but they started out, by just sort of saying, we're going to have a universal public and publicly funded education system. The class sizes were 60 children in a class. And, then they began to say, we've got to educate teachers. So they created the National Institute of Education, the only place in Singapore, which is a relatively populous country, to train teachers. But then they really invested in what will those teachers now be able to do? How will we get them to these, parts of the country? They brought more students in over time. Each iteration of building the system built on what had been there before. The things they did not do, number one, they didn't change their policy the way you change your socks. They didn't say, oh, we're going to do this day and we're going to do something else the next day. They built on what they had done. So education was not, all that innovative or wonderful, at the beginning, but they learned and learned, and then they educated educators. And then they built this idea that the people in the ministry should come from the schools. So you would develop leadership so that everyone was connected in their knowledge base and in their expertise. And even if they were not in ideal conditions, they could improve the conditions very gradually over time. And the other thing they didn't do was they didn't privatize. One of the things that's a conversation around the country, around the globe right now, and in some countries is, should we, create fee-for-service schools, or should we, create private markets for education? I was happy to be able to do some work on this with some colleagues, Bjorn Ostron from Sweden and Frank Adamson from the United States. We published a book called Global Education Reform, and we compared the countries that had done significant privatization with those that had invested in public education, and found stronger outcomes for those who had invested in public education. Cuba outperforming most countries in South America and doing much better than Chile, which had really privatized. Finland doing much better at that point than Sweden, which had really gone into privatization, et cetera. And so I think we have to be thinking about, in countries that are, on a path and beginning a path towards high quality education, about both a very incremental approach and about a public commitment to stay the course, build on what you learn, invest in the educators so they can do that job that you're asking them to do, and then maintain a public investment strategy.
So how do you see, I'm now going to draw on the question from Amir Banji, how do you see the utility in applying these principles you've outlined to higher education?
It would be great to do that. I started out in teaching. I was a high school English teacher before I became, I went back and got my doctorate and became a researcher and so on. And I've taught in the academy for many, many years. And I've experienced, as many others have, that the desirability of professors also learning pedagogy. It would be a good idea for everyone who teaches to know how people learn. And what are the strategies that enable learning to take place. There are universities that have sort of centers for teaching and learning to support that pedagogical conversation. So, I think we need more of that. I think bringing these principles to higher education would allow us to think about the ways in which students are affirmed, supported, and engaged in intellectual inquiry in ways that allow them to tackle rigorous work in challenging ways. So I do think there's room for this everywhere. There's room for the science everywhere. I'll just say in my own practice as a teacher of teachers, which I engaged in, especially at Stanford, I began to apply the principles of iterative learning. So there was never a final paper at the end of the course where you would just get a grade. We would design a task that was related to what the teachers were learning to do in the classroom. We would have elements of it, of the inquiry each week. We would scaffold the different pieces of what they were learning about, so that when they then designed whether it was a curriculum unit or whether it was a case study of a student or whatever it was, they would then be able to share that with other students with a rubric to peer review and give feedback and get feedback from me, and then iterate on revising that work. And the quality, I saw for myself how the quality of work just, it is extraordinarily better when you design education around the way people learn, which is that we learn in this sort of feedback and iteration process around inquiry. And it also enhances equity, so that the people who started with less experience had fewer opportunities to learn that particular thing. As they iterate and iterate, come closer and closer to the highest standard, and everyone improves. So we have an old idea about, give a chapter, give a test, give a grade, like marching through a curriculum, because of the fact that transmission teaching is what we were trying to accomplish in the past. And now we've got to be accomplishing the kind of teaching that empowers the learner to use the knowledge for themselves and apply it. So yes, I'm all for bringing the science into higher education.
So with a very quick response, I hope you can give to this last question, thinking about this notion of iterative learning and the importance of design of learning, what do you think are possible scenarios when the use of AI is becoming so pervasive?
Oh, wow. Well, everybody's talking about the GBot, right? A lot of technologies, the thing about human beings is that we have designed and learned to use tools to allow things to do things in the world. And in schools, we've often thought that the use of these technologies is cheating. Somehow, if you learn to use these technologies, you won't be able to be put on the bell curve the right way. So I think, part of what we've got to figure out is how to strategically integrate technology uses in ways that, on the one hand, allow people to understand what the technology is doing, right? As well as what the thinking process is that they need to develop themselves. But then to be able to use the technology, I would say, bring it into the classroom and have people analyze what it's producing, right? Have them critique what the outcomes are, have them unpack the cognition that's there, because it will then stimulate their own cognition, as well as their ability to use the tool when it's appropriate to do so.
Thank you. I'm reminded about the presence of technology as we are in an online conference with the unforgiving quality that at 12:15 or 2:15 Eastern time, we disappear, I think. So let me very quickly just pull together a couple threads. I want to thank our keynote speaker and our two commentators for really giving us some rich ideas and lots of helpful metaphors about thinking about not just looking back, but the road ahead. I kept thinking about maps and the challenges of mapping whole systems, but also recognizing that the terrain in different places is different, and the importance of our crossing boundaries, our thinking across boundaries, but recognizing the groundedness and the importance of understandings and practices in local places. But that process seems to require, and I think Shijing and Mick Connelly spoke to this importance of, building these conversations, this reciprocal learning. And Linda, you've helped us think about the importance of building sustained, shared understandings and sustained, shared, I would say, kind of imaginations. I think that CIES in many ways offers us an opportunity for that. So I'm delighted that we can begin as the first keynote of this conference to think about what does it mean to have a conversation where we center equity and where we center looking ahead, recognizing that transformation is essential, but it's transformation that requires dialogue of many, across many spaces and positioned very differently. So thank you all, and thank you to your questions. And I think that we become pumpkins in a minute.